George Gershwin. Imagine a world where jazz and classical music never collided. That was almost the case until George Gershwin shattered the divide. Born Jacob Gershwin in the early 1900s to Russian Jewish immigrants, he grew up in the bustling streets of Brooklyn, absorbing the sounds of Tin Pan Alley and ragtime. But Gershwin wasn't just a pianist or a composer. He was a revolutionary. At a time when jazz was dismissed as lowbrow entertainment, he saw its potential to reshape American music. And in an astonishing burst of creativity, he composed Rhapsody in Blue in just 3 weeks. The piece debuted in 1924, and from the very first clarinet glissando, it was clear this was something entirely new. Gershwin's bold fusion of jazz and symphonic music wasn't just a hit, it was a declaration that American music had arrived on the world stage. But despite his success, he faced relentless pushback from the classical establishment. Many critics dismissed his work as too commercial, too unsophisticated, coded language that often masked the anti-Semitic sentiment of the time. Yet Gershwin pressed on, composing everything from Broadway hits to grand orchestral pieces. Tragically, his meteoric rise was cut short. In 1937, at only 38 years old, he died from a brain tumor, leaving behind a legacy that could have reshaped music even further. But even in death, his influence never faded. From film scores to jazz clubs to concert halls, Rhapsody in Blue still echoes through time, a testament to the genius who refused to be confined by tradition. Al Jolson. Before Hollywood had sound, before actors spoke on screen, there was one man whose voice changed everything, at a cost. Al Jolson, born Isa Jolson to Jewish immigrants, wasn't just a star, he was the star of the 1920s. His electrifying stage presence made him the highest-paid entertainer of his time, but his biggest impact came in 1927 when he starred in The Jazz Singer, the first feature-length film to incorporate synchronized dialogue. It wasn't just a movie, it was a revolution. Audiences were stunned as Jolson's voice rang through the theater, marking the end of the silent era and the dawn of the talkies. Hollywood would never be the same. But Jolson's legacy is complicated. He performed in blackface, a practice he defended as an homage to black performers, though today it is widely condemned. Even in his time, some criticized him, while others saw him as a champion of jazz and black music. As Hollywood evolved, his star faded. By the time he passed in 1950, the man once called the world's greatest entertainer was largely forgotten. He had brought sound to Hollywood, but in the end, the industry moved on without him. Fanny Brice. She was the woman who could make an entire theater erupt in laughter with just a glance, but behind the curtain, Fanny Brice's life was anything but a comedy. Born Fania Borak in the late 1800s to Jewish immigrant parents, she wasn't the typical beauty of her era, but what she lacked in conventional looks, she more than made up for with raw talent. With her razor-sharp wit and impeccable comedic timing, she became a vaudeville sensation, proving that humor could be just as powerful as glamour in show business. But while audiences adored her on stage, her personal life was a different story. Her tumultuous love life, particularly her ill-fated marriage to conman Nicky Arnstein, became the inspiration for the Broadway smash Funny Girl, later immortalized by Barbra Streisand. Arnstein, a suave but shady gambler, swept her off her feet, but their relationship was riddled with betrayal. When he was imprisoned for fraud, Brice stood by him, only to have her loyalty repaid with heartbreak. Despite the personal tragedies, she never let the pain overshadow her career. As one of the first female comedians to achieve national fame in a male-dominated industry, she shattered expectations and paved the way for future generations of funny women. But behind the laughter, there was always an undercurrent of sadness, proof that even the brightest stars can carry the heaviest burdens. Melvyn Douglas. He was born Melvyn Edward Hesselberg, but Hollywood knew him as Melvyn Douglas, a name that would become synonymous with sophistication and depth. With his suave demeanor and commanding presence, Douglas became one of the most respected leading men of Hollywood's golden age. But behind the charm and effortless elegance was a man of principle, unafraid to challenge the darkest forces in the industry. At the height of McCarthyism, when fear and paranoia gripped Hollywood, Douglas took a stand. He was an outspoken critic of the House Un-American Activities Committee, refusing to bow to the pressure that silenced so many of his peers. His defiance came at a cost. He was briefly blacklisted, his career put on hold as Hollywood turned its back on those who dared to speak out. But Douglas was not one to be easily broken. He made a triumphant return, proving that talent and integrity could outlast even the most oppressive political storms. Despite being best known for his smooth, debonair roles, Douglas was far more than just a charming leading man. He had a deep intellectual streak, one that shone through in his later years as he transitioned to more dramatic roles. His performances in HUD and Being There earned him 2 Academy Awards, solidifying his place among Hollywood's greatest actors. But his personal life was just as compelling as his career. His marriage to Helen Gahagan Douglas, a congresswoman and outspoken liberal, made him a political target. Richard Nixon, in his infamous Senate campaign against Helen, smeared her as a sympathizer of communist ideals, a tactic that not only ended her political career but also cast a shadow over Douglas's own standing in Hollywood. Yet through it all, he remained steadfast, proving that true artistry is not just about performance, but about conviction. Melvyn Douglas's legacy is one of resilience, talent, and unshakable principles. He navigated Hollywood's most treacherous era with dignity, never compromising his beliefs for the sake of his career. And in the end, he emerged not just as a star, but as a symbol of integrity in an industry that often demanded silence. His story is a testament to the power of standing firm, even when the world tries to push you down. Sophie Tucker. She was loud, brash, and completely unapologetic. Sophie Tucker didn't just break the mold, she shattered it. Born Sonia Kalish in the late 1800s to Jewish immigrants, she transformed herself into one of the most electrifying entertainers of the early 20th century. At a time when female performers were expected to be demure and conventionally beautiful, Tucker proved that talent, charisma, and sheer force of personality mattered more than looks. Her deep, throaty voice and bawdy humor made her an icon, earning her the title of the last of the Red Hot Mamas. But Tucker wasn't just about entertainment. She was a woman ahead of her time. Long before the civil rights movement gained mainstream traction, she refused to perform in segregated venues, standing firm against racial discrimination in an industry that often turned a blind eye. Her audacity paved the way for future generations of bold, trailblazing women in entertainment, inspiring legends like Joan Rivers and Bette Midler. Even decades after her heyday, her influence can still be felt in comedy and music, proving that some voices are simply too powerful to fade. Zero Mostel. At the height of Broadway's golden era, one man's booming voice and larger-than-life presence dominated the stage: Zero Mostel. Born Samuel Joel Mostel to Orthodox Jewish parents in Brooklyn, he was destined for the arts, but his journey to stardom was anything but smooth. Mostel became a Broadway legend with his unforgettable performance as Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof. Yet before that triumph, his career nearly ended in disgrace. During the McCarthy era, Mostel was blacklisted, accused of communist ties, and pressured to name names, but he refused. His defiance cost him years of work, forcing him into obscurity while lesser talents thrived. Yet he refused to be silenced. His fiery comeback and A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum in 1962 re-established him as an irreplaceable force in theater. But Mostel wasn't just known for his comedic brilliance. His temper was legendary. He clashed with directors, co-stars, and anyone who dared challenge his creative vision. Some called him difficult. Others called him a genius. Either way, his career was a testament to resilience, proving that even in the face of blacklists and betrayals, true talent can never be erased. Lillian Hellman. Lillian Hellman was never one to back down from a fight. Born in New Orleans to a Jewish family in the early 20th century, she grew into one of the most formidable playwrights of her time. Her works, like The Children's Hour and The Little Foxes, exposed the dark underbelly of American society, but her greatest battle wasn't on the stage. It was in the political arena. In 1952, she was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee during the height of the Red Scare. Unlike many of her peers, she refused to name names, delivering a now famous statement: "I cannot and will not cut my conscience to fit this year's fashions." That defiance got her blacklisted, costing her work in Hollywood and beyond. But Hellman wasn't just a playwright, she was a fighter, and she never stopped speaking her mind. Her personal life was just as dramatic as her plays. For 3 decades, she was romantically linked to famed mystery writer Dashiell Hammett, the man behind The Maltese Falcon. Their relationship was a whirlwind of passion, politics, and betrayal. Hammett, a known leftist, was also blacklisted and even jailed for refusing to cooperate with the government's anti-communist investigations. Together, they became symbols of resistance, refusing to bow to political pressure even as it cost them nearly everything. But Hellman's legacy took a controversial turn in the later years of her life. Her memoirs, which painted her as a fearless truth-teller, were later accused of embellishment. In a particularly brutal public feud, Fellow writer Mary McCarthy famously declared on television that every word she writes is a lie, including and the. That accusation led to a high-profile defamation lawsuit, but Hellman's reputation never fully recovered. Even today, she remains one of the most debated figures in American literature, a woman who blurred the lines between truth and fiction, both on the stage and in her own life. Marc Chagall. Imagine fleeing for your life, leaving behind everything you know, your home, your family, your culture, only to watch the world you grew up in vanish under the weight of war. That was the reality for him, born Moshe Chagall in a small Belarusian town in the late 1880s. By the time the Nazis swept through Europe, Chagall had already made a name for himself as a revolutionary force in modern art. But fame didn't grant him immunity. In 1941, he narrowly escaped Nazi-occupied France, just in time to avoid the Holocaust that would claim much of his family. His art, once dismissed as too whimsical, too dreamlike, would later become some of the most valuable in the world, a fusion of surrealism, Jewish folklore, and vibrant emotion. Even as he gained international acclaim, Chagall never abandoned his roots. His paintings often depicted Jewish life, floating figures, and vivid colors that seemed to defy gravity itself. His story isn't just one of artistic triumph, it's one of survival, resilience, and redefining what art could be. Milton Berle. In the early days of television, one man stood above the rest, Milton Berle, the first true TV superstar. Dubbed Mr. Television, he didn't just entertain audiences, he owned them. His show, Texaco Star Theater, was so popular in the late 1940s and early 1950s that entire cities reported a drop in water usage during its airtime, because no one wanted to leave their screens. But as fast as he rose, his career crumbled just as quickly. His vaudeville-inspired slapstick, once revolutionary, became outdated almost overnight as television evolved. By the late 1950s, the man who had once commanded the attention of millions was struggling to stay relevant. Berle took immense pride in his Jewish heritage, but Hollywood in its early years wasn't always welcoming. He often faced anti-Semitism behind the scenes, even as he became one of the most recognizable faces in entertainment. Some executives saw him as too brash, too loud, too much of an outsider. But Berle never shied away from his identity, and his success forced Hollywood to take him seriously, whether they liked it or not. Yet, despite his dominance in television's golden age, Berle's personal life was riddled with excess. The rumors about him were legendary. His gambling habits, his womanizing, his extravagant lifestyle. Some of these stories became Hollywood lore whispered about in back rooms and comedy clubs, but as the industry moved on, those same indulgences that once made him a larger-than-life figure became liabilities. By the time the 60s rolled around, Berle had gone from being the king of television to just another entertainer struggling to adapt. His fall from grace wasn't just about changing tastes, it was about the cost of being too big, too fast, and never knowing when to slow down. Benny Goodman. In the early 20th century, jazz wasn't just music, it was a revolution. And at the center of that revolution stood Benny Goodman, a Jewish kid from Chicago who would go on to change the face of American music. Born to poor immigrant parents, Goodman picked up the clarinet as a child and never looked back. By the 1930s, he was leading one of the hottest swing bands in the country. But it wasn't just his music that made history. It was his defiance of racial segregation. At a time when black and white musicians were rarely allowed to share the stage, Goodman shattered that barrier. He hired pianist Teddy Wilson and vibraphonist Lionel Hampton, making him the first major bandleader to integrate his ensemble. This wasn't just a bold move, it was dangerous. Many venues refused to book him, and critics warned that audiences wouldn't accept an integrated band. But Goodman didn't back down, and when his band took the stage at Carnegie Hall in early 1938, jazz was officially legitimized as an art form. That night, black and white musicians played together in one of the most electrifying concerts of the era. But for all his groundbreaking achievements, Goodman had a dark side. He was a ruthless perfectionist, known for firing musicians mid-performance if they didn't meet his impossible standards. Some called him a genius, others called him a tyrant. Either way, his influence is undeniable. Without Benny Goodman, swing music and American music as a whole would never have been the same. Arthur Miller. Arthur Miller wasn't just a playwright, he was a force. Born to Polish Jewish immigrants in New York City, he reshaped American theater with Death of a Salesman in the late 1940s, a play that dissected the crumbling American dream. But while his words made him a legend, his convictions made him a target. By the mid-1950s, the House Un-American Activities Committee was on a mission to root out alleged communist ties in Hollywood and beyond. When Miller was called to testify in 1956, he refused to name names. That single act of defiance got him blacklisted, turning him from a celebrated writer into a political pariah. At the same time, his personal life was a storm of its own. He had married Marilyn Monroe just months before his testimony, and their relationship became an obsession for the press. Monroe, the ultimate Hollywood icon, and Miller, the brooding intellectual, seemed like an unlikely pair. But behind closed doors, their love was unraveling. Monroe struggled with the pressures of fame, and Miller, already under political scrutiny, found himself unable to shield her from the relentless public eye. By 1961, their marriage had collapsed, leaving behind a trail of heartbreak and speculation. Despite his towering literary achievements, Miller's legacy was often overshadowed by Monroe's. Even today, his name is frequently tied to hers, a painful irony for a man who spent his life crafting stories about identity, struggle, and truth. Yet his defiance against McCarthyism and his unflinching artistic vision cemented his place in history, whether Hollywood wanted to remember him for it or not. George Burns and Gracie Allen. George Burns and Gracie Allen were the perfect comedy duo, witty, charming, and effortlessly in sync. But behind their legendary on-screen chemistry was a heartbreaking reality few knew. Burns, born Nathan Birnbaum to Jewish immigrants in the early 20th century, found his perfect partner in Allen, both professionally and personally. Their banter and timing made them one of Hollywood's most beloved couples. But off-screen, they carried a painful secret. Allen suffered from a debilitating heart condition that worsened over the years, forcing her to retire in the early 1950s. Burns, devoted as ever, stood by her side, but the loss of performing together was devastating. When Allen passed in 1964, Burns was shattered. He never remarried and continued to visit her grave regularly, even reserving the space next to hers. Despite his grief, he threw himself into work, performing well into his 90s, even winning an Academy Award. But behind the laughter, he carried the weight of losing his greatest love. Their story wasn't just about comedy. It was about devotion, sacrifice, and the price of fame. And while Hollywood saw them as the perfect pair, only a few knew the struggles they faced, from financial hardships early in their careers to the immense pressure of maintaining their wholesome image. Burns may have outlived Allen by decades, but in his heart he never left her side. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our new videos each week. Thanks for watching.